far-fetched and outlandish in my opinion, which I realize is ironic to say when talking about a series that revolves around werewolf crimes, but still. Hey y'all, my name is Nat. I hope you're having a terrific day today, and for this video we are going to be doing my May wrap-up. Alright, before you get into anything bookish, make sure to hit like and subscribe down below, as well as tell me in the comments how many 5 stars did you have this month and what were they? So obligatory, oh my god, can you believe we're into June already? Years literally just disappearing. As per usual, let's go ahead and jump into my stats because I'm really proud of these this month. In May, I read 18 books, and across those 18 books, I read 5,931 pages. This is my most successful reading month, including both books and page count, and that is fantastic. This page count number does include converting audiobook hours to pages, but in regard to audiobook hours, I listened to roughly 68 hours. That's a lot of audiobook reading. My average rating for the month came out to 4.17 stars, which is phenomenal. Anytime my average rating is above 4 stars, it makes me feel warm inside. Though, unfortunately, I did have 1 DNF. This month, I read a lot from the same genres. So I had 3 fantasy books, 4 manga, 5 romances, as well as 5 sci-fi, and 1 thriller. For the little goals I keep for myself, I did read a book that was more than 450 pages. I also did read a comic or manga, though unfortunately, I did not read a nonfiction book, which I really need to work on this one the most. And then finally, for my series tracker, I also had some really fantastic numbers. First off, I started into 2 new series, though one of them I'm still not 100% sure on if I will be continuing it or not. We'll talk about it when we get there. I had 8 books that were continuations of series. I finished 2 series, which always makes me feel great. And then I did make the decision that I was not going to continue 1 series. Last month, I went from my lowest rated to my highest rated, so I thought this month let's try the inverse. And then just as a little reminder, I only talk about books here that I didn't read for specific themed reading vlogs. I think I had 3 different reading vlogs that came out this month. I had a raid my shelves of lowest rated books, I had a anticipated releases reading vlog, and then I also had a Star Wars canon project reading vlog. So if you're interested in any reviews for those books, go watch those actual videos. So we are going to be starting out very positive with my 5-star reads, and thankfully I had a good few of those. First up is Wolf in Sheep's Clothing by Charlie Adhara. This is the 4th book in the Big Bad Wolf series, in which we are following Cooper Dayton. He has just recently found out that werewolves are a real thing and has been moved into this specific sector of the FBI that investigates crimes regarding werewolves. In the first book, he ends up partnering with Oliver Park, a member of the Trust, which is kind of like a governing body for werewolves, and the 2 of them slowly start to form a partnership, learn to trust each other, while at the same time some romantic feelings grow. And I have been adoring this series. If you've missed my last few wrap-ups, it's been phenomenal, and this was my favorite of the series. By the 4th book, these 2 are in a committed relationship. Honestly, things are going really great for them. I am so impressed with the character work that goes on throughout this entire series because every single installment reveals more about the characters, reveals more about their underlying issues, and we get to see them work on those as an individual, but also as a couple, and how they come together and grow through those problems. And because of the writing around the character development, the writing around the relationship is also just so natural and realistic and feels very authentic. On top of that though, the plot in this one was so much fun. These 2 end up going to a werewolf retreat where they're trying to investigate this missing man. They're doing so in a very unofficial capacity and instead are pretending to be clients of this retreat. It does cause for some awkward situations and some really funny scenes. Also, this got a little bit spicier than the previous books, and I'm not gonna complain about that. It was very good. Ran through this one so quickly. It was, like I said, my favorite of the series, glowing 5 stars. I also had another fantastic 5-star book that was a queer romance, The Prospects by Katie Hoffman. I'd been looking forward to this book ever since I saw the cover. In this, we are following Gene, who is an open, gay, and trans man that is playing for minor league baseball. Just at the start of this book, he has unfortunately been pushed from his favorite spot of shortstop to second base when Luis Estrada joins the team. Luis and Gene actually went to college together and played on the same team, but Luis ended up moving up to the big leagues and never saying goodbye to Gene. And Gene sort of held on to that and taken it personally for the last few years. Pretty early on, we learned that both these men aren't expecting to ever move up to the major leagues. They both think they're going to be stuck in this minor league and that they shouldn't really wish for anything more, but just be happy with the family they found on this team. But then both of them are surprised by getting an opportunity, which is why the book is called The Prospects. This was adorable, funny, sweet, spicy. Like, I just really had the best time with this story. Jean is so incredibly likable. It is so easy to root for him, and not just because he's an underdog character in this sort of a setup, but also because he just has a phenomenal personality. It's really hard not to enjoy him. Once we meet Luis and we finally get to see a little bit deeper into his character, once Jean and he are finally kind of trying to become friends, work together as teammates. And I felt much the same about him, an underdog who you can't help but root for, but also just a really likable, sweet dude. Watching the two of them together is so much fun. They have a really awesome dynamic. At the start, there is this tension because Jean still is bitter about Luis not having said goodbye to him, and then even more bitter about the fact that he has gotten pushed from shortstop to second base. So things don't start on the best foot. But then there's all this really sweet teasing and these small moments to showcase that they're not really as mean as they might come across, and they can understand what the other person is going through at different times. Once they start working together to try and improve their ability to perform as a team, I was so sold on them. Literally every named character in this book I felt was actually pretty well created. I understood a little bit more about them, and I was so convinced by any relationships they were involved in, whether that be romantic or platonic. I was also really impressed by the little details that will be woven into the story that add some aspects of representation, but also just felt very authentic and realistic to the real world. Vince is Jean's best friend as well as sort of landlord, and he suffers from chronic pain, and his husband is deaf, whereas Louise has anxiety. One of his sisters has Down syndrome. The manager of the team is a lesbian. Like, all of these things just were small little nuggets of information that would be dropped in a way that didn't feel forced in. The plot itself is actually really well paced. There was no miscommunication at any point. The third act conflict actually made perfect sense for the entire setup of the story. It more required each of these two to self-reflect on their own issues and then eventually come back together after they'd figured out what they wanted. And I also just think it was resolved in a very sweet way. I also got really invested in the team's success, and I didn't really know how that was gonna come across, seeing as how I'm not really a sports person, although baseball is one of the few sports I played and can actually follow. And also I wasn't sure how Hoffman was going to showcase the games, whether we're gonna follow every single one of them or, you know, just time skip each of them. But I think they did a good job of kind of balancing, showcasing some moments and then skipping when necessary. I got really invested in the team's success, and I think that also made Jean's fears that we learn about all the more realistic and made me more invested in those as well. Honestly, I was very impressed by the self-reflection each of these boys go through. I think it just made the emotions tied into every aspect of the story feel that much deeper. I loved this. It was 5 glowing stars. I have tons of annotations in it, and I cannot wait to see what Hoffman does next. For my final 5-star we're going to talk about, I have Soul Eater Volume 13 by atsushi ohkubo. I'm going to talk about a good few volumes of this. If you're new to my channel or you haven't heard about this series, it is set in a fantastical world where there are people who are considered meisters and weapons. They train under Shinigami Lord Death in order to eventually either become a head meister of these weapons or for the weapon to become a death scythe that is used by the Shinigami himself. We follow a group of students who attend this school training to become either meisters or weapons, and particularly 3 different teams. This one came out to 5 stars because it was so incredibly fast paced. Every single chapter you see a different fight unfolding. There's a good bit of development that is mentioned at the beginning with Black Star and 𝗖cie, which is impressive seeing as how Black Star is my least favorite character to follow. I actually start to enjoy him around this point because he is starting to sort of mellow out. He isn't quite so egotistical and narcissistic anymore. He's finally starting to be more of a partner, but still while insisting he will become the best Deathmeister ever. I was blazing through pages as I read this one. It was probably the fastest one I've read in a minute because it's just so exciting, and I was pulled to the edge of my seat the entire time. 5 stars. Then for the previous 3, volume 10, 11, and 12, this is all sort of building up to this giant action sequence that's happening here where most of the team is trying to infiltrate this bad guy's lair, and you get to see little bits of, I don't want to say politics because it's not quite politics, but the different players involved in this plan. But then there's also a little bit of mystery going on. There's a dramatic reveal of a double crosser, a lot of fun stuff going on throughout these 3, on top of some good character development with Maka and Soul, as well as some side characters like 𝗖cie and 𝗁. All of these three came out to about 4.5 stars. Really enjoyed them. There is a little bit of fan service in these, I will say, but thankfully it's not done in a way where it comes across like it's trying to be sexual. It's more just like casual nudity. It also just kind of happens in manga. Then I finished out the Big Bad Wolf series with Cry Wolf by Charlie Adhara. I can't believe it's over. I'm heartbroken that I'm not gonna get to see more of these boys because Adhara has just made me fall in love with Oliver and Cooper so much, as well as their relationship. Like I said for the prior book, I just applaud their character work. It is so fantastic. I wouldn't be surprised if I start comparing other books to this series when it comes to character development because Adhara just does it so fantastically. And I think every book in this series is under 300 pages, which makes it even more impressive. That said, unfortunately, I think this was my least favorite of the series because 90% of it is just focused on the mystery. By this point, Oliver and Cooper are in a very committed relationship, pretty much engaged, and so I was hoping for more wedding hijinks, more exploration around the differences in becoming a established couple in your society with the human world versus the wolf world, on top of just seeing more of each of their families, which we do get a little bit more of Cooper's family, and I did appreciate that. But I wanted more in that regard. Like I said, a lot of this one is dedicated to the mystery that's a little far-fetched and outlandish in my opinion, which I realize is ironic to say when talking about a series that revolves around werewolf crimes, but still, I can't believe that's it. I definitely will be revisiting these dorks in the future because I love them. This one came out to 4 stars. I also finished out the Winter Night trilogy with The Winter of the Witch by Katherine Arden, which worked out very well. Seeing as how I picked this to fulfill my continuous series prompt from my TBR jar, continued and finished. So like I said, this is the 3rd book in the Winter Night trilogy, which is set in 12th century Russia, I believe. And the series starts following this young girl, 𝗖cie, who is able to see magical beings from Russian folklore and how her life continues, but also how these stories from fantasy folklore are mixed into Russian history. Honestly, I think the series finished out on a fairly decent note. I don't think this is gonna be a new favorite series. The highlights I've had for the last 2 books did continue here. The writing is very whimsical, very atmospheric. Arden weaves the historical elements into the fantastical pieces very well. 𝗖cie is a really likable character, so staunchly feminist that I could not love her. I honestly think she will be the most memorable part of the series. I did have a few negatives, unfortunately. One of the biggest ones being that there's a romance going on throughout the series that, first off, is a trope I never like to see, but second off, it just felt very underdeveloped. I wanted more from it. I really did not feel strongly about it until these two were officially a couple. And so I wasn't convinced by their relationship. On one hand, I was really impressed with the pacing throughout this entire series because like there is never any time between the books. The events of this book literally continue right off of the events of the 2nd book. So on one hand, it's very impressive that Arden streams these stories together so well. But on the other hand, I actually think this would have benefited from some time skips because 𝗖cie is still relatively young. I mean, this is an adult fantasy series, but she is 17 at the closeout of this book. There are so many events that go on here. She goes through so much. And every time I would remember that fact, it would kind of mess with my perception of the story because again, she has experienced so much. I do realize that her age makes sense for like a lot of events in the series. I think if there was time between these 3 books, that would have sort of allowed for some time to breathe between the events, but also allow 𝗖cie to mature in a way that wasn't purely because of the trauma she's experienced, which is forcing her to grow up. On top of that, I had an issue in the 2nd book with aspects of the plot purely being due to miscommunication between characters. And unfortunately, that happened again here where there was lack of communication between 𝗖cie and some of the 𝗖cie, which are the folklore mythical beings that she can communicate with. How was she supposed to know that's what y'all wanted her to do if you didn't tell her that? And that's just annoying. Then finally, when I read the author's note and she mentioned the fact that she really wanted to involve the Battle of Kulikovo, she really wanted to involve that in the story. And I find that very ironic given the fact that it is probably the element of the plot that I was least invested in. The fantastical war that goes on here was so much more interesting to me, and that wraps up only for the next battle to be tagged on. And it messed with pacing also. I think if she had intertwined those two, I would have been more invested, but unfortunately, it just seemed sort of odd in how she handled it. I did, however, really like the further exploration of 𝗖адцí's history and where her family comes from. I thought that was very cool, though there was a certain element that sort of just tagged on there at the end and maybe feels a little like a convenience to give her more power. Then speaking of family, I also really enjoyed the development of her brother 𝗖cie, who is a holy man, and he grows through learning about their history and the 𝗖cie and how integral a part they play to their culture, especially seeing as how the series has been about the connection between cultural beliefs and religious beliefs. To round everything out, I think this was a solid ending to the series, but as I said, I don't really think this is going to be a new favorite series for me, unfortunately. Initially, I think it came out to a 4-star on my cop pile, but really, I think my feelings for it are more like a 3.5 because I definitely had more gripes with this one than I did with the 2 prior books, and I rated both of those 4 stars. Next, as a part of my Galactathon TBR, I had to read a book that was published before 2010, and seeing as how I had very few of those on my TBR in the first place, I thought, why not find something that could double count for my fantasy bingo board, where I needed to read a book published in the 90s. Hard mode version is if the author has come out with a new book in the last 5 years. Well, K.A. Applegate of the Animorphs fame, she fulfilled that. So I finally read The Invasion. This is the first book in the Animorphs series. I know it is insanely shocking that somehow I never read this series when I was younger. My brother has been trying to get me to read it for years, and I finally did. This series follows a group of kids who witness an alien landing on their planet and learn that apparently there are these different alien species that are trying to overtake Earth and may already be more involved in local politics than the kids are initially thinking. This alien bestows on them the ability to shapeshift into different animals, and so these kids use this ability to try and, stop the opposing alien species. Honestly, I was actually pretty impressed with this. First off, if you want to read these, you can find them for free in a podcast setup on Spotify as audiobooks. K.A. Applegate has totally signed off on these books being free to find on the internet, so I think that's very awesome and just want to put that fact out there. I will admit the story did feel like a middle grade book, and I don't really tend to read many of those in the first place. So I did kind of have a hard time getting invested into the story just because I could see a lot of where the twists were going. I could expect a lot of issues that were going to pop up. I wasn't really shocked by anything that took place. But at the same time, it also reminded me of a lot of different stories I enjoyed when I was younger, and so I totally get why everybody else loved these whenever they were like at the height of their popularity, and even now. The cast of kids all seemed their age. They all interacted in a way that felt realistic and true to the dynamic that's been explained to us. I genuinely don't think any of them really stood out to me. I know there was one kid that's kind of obnoxious and doesn't really want to get involved because of his home issues. There's another kid who really wants to get involved because of his home issues and to use this as an escape. Characters weren't particularly memorable to me, but maybe if I read the next book in the series, I would start to get more engaged with them. As I said, the plot itself was a fun ride, but nothing was overly shocking, though I do think it might be to younger readers. Again, take that critique with a grain of salt. This is the one where I'm not 100% sure on if I will be continuing this series. I think I will mark it as ongoing on my tracker. I really don't know when I'll pick up the next one. The audiobook was 3.5 hours, but there are 50 books in this series. That is such a large undertaking. I don't know when I'll continue. We'll find out. Like I said, it was good. I'm just not the intended audience for it. Kind of going off that comment, I'm also going to talk about Dragonfruit by makiia Lucier, which I read for the Full Moon Book Club. This is based on Polynesian mythology, which is super cool. I like that. We're following specifically Hanali of Tamarind, who a page to the princess. The princess and herself were both poisoned, and her father ended up stealing a dragon egg and using that to save his daughter's life, though unfortunately at the expense of the queen. At the same time, we're also following Sam, the queen's son, who was friends with Hanali when they were younger, and Hanali finally at 18 has returned to this island, trying to stop some pirates from taking these dragon eggs, and then eventually helping Sam to find them to try and save the queen. Honestly, this was fine. I think if I was younger or if I was newer to fantasy, I would have liked this a lot more, but it was underwhelming to me, unfortunately. I think the only aspects of the story I felt strongly about was this one sort of horrific scene that took place. That was wild and handled in a pretty gross and cool way. Then the fact that they have tattoo magic, that is awesome. Some people in this universe will have a tattoo appear on their skin, usually in some sort of an animal or an insect form, and it will actually become a familiar to them. It can remove itself from them, which 𝗖cie the bat was one of those, and so he was also one of my few favorites of the story. The plot itself was okay. I liked it enough to keep reading, but it really wasn't anything to make this book stand out. And none of the characters did either. Hanale, everything we learned about her background did make sense for the character we were meeting, but I just didn't really engage with her a lot. I didn't feel pulled in by her personality or any specific element of her story. And off of that, the romance existed, I guess. Honestly, in the end, this one was pretty forgettable, unfortunately. Yeah, a 3-star. Then I've got Ancillary Justice by leckie. I also read this one because my Galactathon TBR, I needed a book that featured a AI character. And in this, we are following Breck, who was a being that was a part of this hive mind of different ancillaries, which were all tied to a ship. Now, in the present time, she is an individual and she is trying to get revenge against the person responsible for cutting her off from the rest of the group. The idea for this book was very cool to me, but I don't really think the execution of it works for my taste. I felt absolutely nothing from Breck, honestly. And as a character-based reader, I need a little bit. She's a cold character, which does make sense seeing as how, you know, she was an AI and used to be part of a hive mind. But that fact also made it very difficult for me to connect with her, meaning it was hard for me to care about her plans or really get invested in the story at all. There are 2 alternate timelines in this. You have the present day Breck, who has been cut off from the hive mind, and then you have 20 years prior where the hive mind Breck is a part of has just recently started overtaking this planet. And I actually preferred that timeline just because I was learning more about the world building that was going on here, but I also had such a hard time with the world building. I also think there was a bit more explanation of the plot there because you were starting to kind of build up towards what removed Breck from this hive mind. It also felt like it dragged a lot. So there wasn't a character I could really connect with, and the plot wasn't very engaging to me, meaning this didn't work for me personally. The fact that in the past timeline, the main character is kind of an entire ship was confusing, but I also think the author handled it in a clever way at times. There would be some scenes where you shift between perspectives of 2 different ancillaries tied to the hive mind having separate conversations. I am a visual person. I want everything explained to me so I can picture it in my head, and I had such a hard time doing that with these ships. I don't know what that word means, so I don't know what I should be picturing. I actually think if there was like a map or schematics in the book, that would have been so incredibly helpful for me. So in the end, my rating for this very much showcases that this book was not for me. The writing style was not my taste. A lot of the elements of the story were interesting, but the execution just didn't really fit with what I was wanting. So the rating is this wasn't for me 2.5 star. Finally, the last book we're going to be talking about is my did not finish for the month, Lilith by Nikki Marmery. And I picked this up for the Story Continued book club, and obviously since this is named Lilith, you can guess it is a retelling of the Jewish creation myth, which sounds really interesting. However, this really wasn't what I went in hoping for. Or, okay, well it was, but the writing around Lilith as a character just never allowed me to connect with her. Again, I'm a character-based person. So when I was 140 pages in, and I still didn't really care about character as a person because of what we've seen her experience. Rather, you know, I cared about her because she's a feminist figure in the story. But at the same time, that's not enough to keep me pushing through, so I decided to cut my losses. I like the idea of this book, especially since I love learning about different religions and the similarities and differences between those. The author does mix pieces of the Jewish creation story, Christianity, and from what I researched, I believe an ancient Egyptian religion. So the mixing of those I did think was cool. There were certain parts that I thought were very clever of how the author would represent certain things. But that being said, Lilith is a Jewish-based figure most of the time, and there were a lot of elements that felt like they were more pulling on Christian stories. So there's a little bit of dissonance there. And then the feminist themes, while I enjoy, a lot of them felt very on the nose. So another one where I liked the idea of the book, but I just wasn't really loving the execution of it. The writing sometimes felt very flowery, sometimes very cut and dry. sci-fi. Some of it was a lot more aged, some of it was very modern, meaning like the writing itself wasn't something I loved about the story either. Like I said, I decided to cut my losses and just officially DNF'd this at 140 pages in. All right, so that is it for today, y'all. Thank you so much for coming to my channel. I really appreciate it. Make sure to hit like and subscribe down below. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, leave me a snake emoji in the comments. I have all my socials as well as a few ways you can support me linked in the description. I come out with videos on Monday and Friday, but until then, I hope you continue to have a terrific day. Love you, bye!